Right? Well, so I have heard on the internet, or interwebs, that there's some sort of chatter around the sort of hats that I wear. And there's some sort of competition, so I thought that I'd just sort of preempt the whole thing, and I became the lamp stack. That's my contribution. Also, although you can't really see it all that well, so I'm going to take that off now. Although you can't really see it all that well, I found this awesome quote about hats on the interwebs, so we'll just let it play for a second, see if we can hear it.
Why are you always stealing ladies?
I'm going to make one marry me.
That's stupid!
Your hat is stupid!
My hat is awesome!
So there we go. Now we know my hat is in fact awesome. So what I'd like to talk about are sort of 5 design myths in the open source world. There's like one thing that keeps... everybody talks about what's keeping Linux from making its way to the true desktop, what's keeping it from crossing the chasm of early adopters to the main sort of market. And there are lots of theories there. Mine is that until people can actually use it and that it's more usable than its alternatives, then the cost of adoption and switching is going to be too high for people actually to make that move. So to cross that chasm, we have to engage not only our engineers, we have to engage the designer community and get them involved in open source. So there's sort of 5 myths that I think currently keep the open source world, which is really nothing but the world's best and largest engineering department, to get us to help build that sort of best and largest design department to go along with it. Let's see, let's make sure this all works. There we go. So myth number 1. Interface design means aesthetic design. I see this one all the time. In fact, when I used to do consulting, I'd come in and people would say, okay, here's your job. You get to choose a really nice color blue. If you're really lucky, a nice color green, or maybe a brown. And there's a lot more to interface design than that, right? So here's a little parable. So can anybody actually see this up here? Well, that's awesome. Well, that is, in fact, a shovel. Well, you're just going to have to assume, then, that I'm incredibly funny, so please laugh often. My slides are, in fact, wittier than I am, so I'm going to have to be making do. So this is a picture of a shovel, in case nobody can tell, and it says beneath that, Digger, without an E, 2.0 spec, right? And it's a great shovel because, here we go, because it has the shovel bit, right, the part that does the digging, the blade, and then it has a handle. And the cool thing is that, in most companies and in sort of the world which is open source, people spend a lot of time working on the blade of the shovel, right? They make it diamond-encrusted titanium bladed. That's your algorithm. That's the thing you spend lots of time on. And, of course, you then get to the end of your development cycle. You want to release. You end up with this, which is also a blank screen. And what is there is, again, that same blade, but now with a very, very short handle, right? Because if you don't concentrate on interface design, well, what you get is that you don't have much time to do it, so you just sort of slap something on it, and you get something which is unusable, right? So that's the release, and then you can sort of see that giant tractor in the background, and it says underneath that Microsoft with a $sign, Human Hand Enterprise release, but oh well. Now that's your cue to laugh a lot. Thank you. All right. Wow, okay. So what's the best interface, right? And on my next slide, I'm going to show you what it is, but of course you can't see it, so take that. And I guess it's sort of an audacious claim that I can show you the next, or on the next slide, the very best interface possible, right? Across any application, across any device. And that's what it is, which looks exactly like all the other screens, but this one is meant to be that way, and in fact it's blank. And that's because no interface is the best interface, right? If you even know that you're using an interface, it somehow failed, right? And it's actually one of the terms for my profession is interaction designer. And it's a little bit ironic that if I do my job perfectly well, then nobody even realizes I've done it, which is the ultimate sort of Zen thing, I suppose, and a little bit depressing, but it's true. So what's better than the shovel? Well, again, you can't really tell, but now all of a sudden on the screen there's a hole. Little did you know. Because what's better than a shuttle? It's already having the thing done. Oh, right? So if anybody here invents a shovel that can make a hole without actually needing the shovel, please let me know. That would be awesome. But your programs, right? When you go out to design, to make a program for a user, the metric of success for a program is how many users you get, right? That's the currency. So if they are doing the task that they want to without realizing they're using a program, then you've won. In fact, there's a sort of a parable, which is anytime you ask a user to make a decision that they don't care about, you have failed. So my favorite example of this, which is clearly done by an engineer, was, has anybody ever tried to do a search in Windows? I know you say boo, but like a file search? Okay, so the first time you do it, you know what happens? A pop-up box comes up and says, you have a choice. Dear user, you have a choice. One, in the future, your searches can be fast, but at the expense of eating up a lot of your hard drive space. Or two, this one's the really good one, it can be slow, and we won't use up much hard drive space. So fast and use up your hard drive space, or slow and don't use up your hard drive space. Now choose. And it's forever going to be that way. And users don't care about this, right? It's sort of depressing. Actually, I hate making that choice too. And this is somebody in engineering sitting thinking, okay, well, we have this choice. Why should I make it? I'll just offset it to the user. This is one of the things that Ubuntu does very well, which is keeps the user from having to make unnecessary decisions. So the parable at the end is to the interface, is that to the user, your interface, your design is the product. That's why it's so much more than choosing a color blue. And there's actually a lot of math that goes into interface design, although very few people realize this. I come from a background in both math and physics. I did dark matter research at University of Chicago and then Tokyo Daigaku, which is Tokyo University, before going to Caltech. And before dropping out of Caltech, I was doing neuroscience. And after that, I dropped out, so I'd like to say I went from dark matter to gray matter to no matter. But so we use something in interface design called information efficiency. So getting back to that idea of that blank screen, what's best, and me being audacious and saying, like, I can tell you what the best interface is. Well, information efficiency, almost no one knows about, not even people in my field, which is depressing, but it means I get a job. And so in interface design, right, in engineering, we have a measure of efficiency, right? When you design a car, it's energy out over energy in. That gives you your efficiency. And you know that if you have an engine which is 20% efficient, well, actually you're doing fairly well, but at least Detroit would think so, then you can improve a lot. But if you're near 1 or 100% efficiency, you can't improve much. So in interface design, we have the same thing, right? You can just take information required over information input, flip that, and you'll get an efficiency. So a really simple example of this is your watch, right? Digital versus analog. Take a look at a digital watch. If you count the number of button presses you have to do, there are generally, on average, 36. There's mode, there's choose hour, choose minute, right? That's a lot of button pushes. And we can figure out how many bits of information that is because, well, there are 4 buttons you're pushing, so each one connotes 2 bits of information, right? Log base 2 of 4 is 2. So, that's 36 times 2, so that's a lot of information, right? That's like 60-ish bits of information. Thank you. That's one of the things that I dropped out of Caltech for. How much information is on your watch in general? If you assume that there are, 12 minutes, I can't do math on stage. There's 720, we'll just get to the end, number of minutes in a 12-hour cycle. So log base 2 of that is roughly 9.2. So there are 9.2 bits of information, so you realize that, let's see, am I getting this right? Yeah, 9 over 720 gets you, I think, like something ridiculous, like 10, 15, 11% efficiency. If you look at a watch that pulls and turns, right, a crown, well, there are exactly 720 positions on that, 720 positions of the time, so you get an efficiency of 1. So you can't do much better than that. So these are some of the actual tools that helps. Everybody knows the bike shed principle in design? So the bike shed principle says that people will always comment on, especially in sort of open source communities, things that they understand. Right? So people don't understand necessarily security backends, but they do understand what color an interface is. So that's why everybody has an opinion on what color, what buttons get put on an interface, but nobody has an opinion on what encryption mechanism to use, right? So interface design is fraught with people arguing over things even though they don't have very good information behind it because it's so easy to conceptually understand it. So these are some of the tools that you can use. Oh, good. Let's see. Getting a little bit far afield. So the best UI insult is that your personality is nothing but a thin veneer over your underlying implementation. And what I have on the next screen is something that I'll come back to, and this is Google's Calendar program. And if you look at it, it looks exactly like a thin veneer over an underlying database, right? And we see this all the time in the open source world, is that, I mean, even for bookmarks and Mozilla stuff, it looks like we just took a database schema and slapped something over the top of it, right? But to our users, the interface is the product, and so now you're saying that your database is the product. This is not right. Okay, so myth number 2. So myth number 1 was interface design is all about aesthetics, but it's not. There's a lot more to it. Myth number 2 is adding a fancy animated GUI doesn't make it easy, right? This is something I get all the time when trying to sort of talk to people in the open source world. It's like, well, we'll just add a GUI, we'll make it look like Apple, and it'll be great. So I have a thing here. Hopefully you'll be able to see this, and this is Google. And if you ask any marketer, they'll say this is horrible, right? There's a whole bunch of functionality wrapped up in that search box, and I'll come back to search boxes and typing in a bit. But there's so much information wrapped up in that search box that we need to show off, right? So what does it do? It needs more interaction. So it actually does, it calculates, it tracks flights, it tracks packages, searches discography, finds movies, does maps, restaurants, locations, and it does stock and finance search, and I'm sure I'm missing a lot, and they probably came out with one since I started writing this. So I just made it look, I just added all those things, so check this out. Right? We've made it easier. We've taken those features, which people need to see, and we put them on the front page. This is awesome. And not only that, we've increased SEO. Look how many times we got Google and search on this page. All right. But that's really Web 1.0. Let's Ajaxify. Let's see what else we can do. It also, it looks really ugly, right? Nobody would use that. So here's the solution, right? We have something called jQuery, which is great. We can just bust up an accordion. So check this out. Right. I mean, so you can go like, ooh, this is starting to get a little bit sexy. But notice, 1, that you've seen a lot of sites that do this, Yahoo, and 2, that we've reduced a lot of usability here, right? It's much harder to use this. It takes a lot more time. There's a lot more interaction here. And yet there's this sort of interaction seduction that people can fall into. So let's keep going. There's too much text, right? Everybody says that icons are great because that way you don't have to localize. Unfortunately, generally icons make it much worse because that makes it equally unintelligible in all languages. So here we go. Here's my example. So it's the same fun bits over here, but now check this out. Up at the top, we have all those boring words replaced with beautiful icons. The problem is I made those icons, and I can't remember what they do. So here's web search. This one's clearly video. I don't know what the one next to it is, but oh, it's news. Okay. Maps. Right? So I've once again increased interaction. This is another reason, it's sort of a rule of thumb for knowing why this is bad. Because to be able to see what those things do, guess what? I have to mouse over them. So this is hurt things, fundamentally. And yet again, we see this as a very strong push, even in the open source world, of people being like, well, to make something easier to appeal to more people out there, we'll just remove the words and put in icons. And it's a little bit sad, right? We need to push back. Still too boring. Okay. Let's really zazz this up. Those things across the top, what happens if we get 25 of those? That's not scalable. But you know what is scalable? Watch this. Right? So now we have the great new Google. It looks simpler, and I'll come back to that in a second. But it sort of sucks for usability. And again, it's scary because you see sites that look like this, right? You see programs that look like this. You see people pushing towards interfaces that require a whole bunch of interaction that look sexy, that have this sort of gooey, fancy, animated UI, and they're worse. So when I go and participate in open source worlds, and I start talking about better UIs, this is often what people have in their heads. This is the myth that we need to keep people from thinking about when we say, like, we need to make it more usable. And they think, programs will think, I don't want to spend hours and hours and hours making animations for no good reason when I could just type it and it'd be done, right? So what people like to say is that this is a rich internet application. What I like to say is that it's not a rich internet application. In fact, it's a MIA, or materialistic internet application. I also say it's MIA because I wish it was. And what we want is a ZIA, or Zen internet application. That's a lot of what I talk about at Humanized, and what I'm hoping to bring to Mozilla. And that's the act without doing, to be able to use an interface, use a product without actually realizing you're using it, which is pretty cool. So once you get back to this sort of Google thing, right, you look and you're like, I've just crawled across the desert full of the hulks and dead husks of Web 1.0, Web 2.0 companies. This is like a breath of fresh interface water. Don't ask me what a breath of water is. So this is an interaction oasis. And so the mantra, there we go, I can speak English, at the end is, don't force users to ask for more content, just give it to them. So what I'd like to show, and this is going to be a little bit difficult, is one of the things that I came up with is, how do you actually improve upon Google's work, right? And this isn't going to work also because I don't have the internets. That's okay. So essentially what this is, and you can go check it out at humanized.com/reader, is that it's asking the question of, well, can we make pagination better? And the answer was sure. Right now, when you go to the bottom of a page, it'll show you the Google, long letters, and show you 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 to get to more and more results. And that's not optimum because, one, you have to click. Two, once you find something on page 4, it's hard to find it again, right? There's no semantic meaning to clicking on 4 or 5. You see something very similar on the New York Times page when they paginate articles, right? And you have to read through the first little bit, then you click the next button, read through the second little bit. Do you know why they do that? Right? That's the important one. The other one is they wanted to decrease page download times, or increase page download speeds. But you're right, it's ads. But here's the thing. So the answer is quite simple. If you get near the bottom of the page, we'll use lazy loading, right? And you just use Ajax to pull in a little bit more. So it's very simple. And if you actually go look at these things, it just works. You just scroll down and down and down. You see more and more results. So I called attention to this, and in the bike shed principle, people jumped all over it after I blogged on it and said, well, the bar will jump, people won't be able to figure it out. And so a friend of mine over at unspace.ca implemented it, a guy named Pete Ford, in a project of his, entirely unrelated. And the awesome thing was that there were 16,000 people that had used it by the time he decided to blog about it, and only one of them had noticed what was going on. And he blogged about it because he liked it so much. I actually was giving a talk similar to this at the Ajax Experience, and somebody at this point raised their hand, like, yes? And he says, I'm that person. Which is really scary for me because at that moment I realized that people from the internet were there. But this is, okay, so this is sort of cool. And getting back to the whole ads thing, right? Well, you're using Ajax. You can load a new ad anyway, so it's not much of an excuse. I'm still in the process of trying to get the New York Times to use it. And they're prototyping it, so that's cool. What else can scroll simplify? This is fun. I really like sort of taking the idea of you have a very basic number of mechanisms, and you reapply them, right? So over and over again. So we've just used scroll in sort of a cool and unusual way. So what else can we do? And I put up a puzzler about tabs in Firefox, because the tabs in Firefox, when it went from 1 to 2, went from okay to worse. And that was because as you had more and more tabs, they shrunk and shrunk and shrunk and shrunk. And that was okay. You couldn't really see them, but at least you had a mental model of they're, an inch and a half from the left side of my screen. When we got to Firefox 2, we added a little buttons that let you move back and forth. and scroll along your set of tabs. So we've added a whole new set of interactions, right? Getting back to the whole, you should just want a whole. You just want to be able to get to your tab. You don't want to have to interact. I said, that's not cool. What we need to do is figure out a better way. So I opened it up as a contest. And a guy named Brett Victor at Worry Dream came up with this awesome thing. Now watch if I can. Oh, watch this. Cool. So I really hope you guys can see it, sort of. The basic idea is that he's conflated the idea of tabs and the scroll bar. So if I open up a new tab here, it just slid down right below the page I was on. Can you guys sort of see that? All right. So as you scroll down, you see that? There's just, the page is right there. Scroll down past this one, and the page is right there. And if you move your cursor over to the right side of the page, you get to see that this is a scroll bar, but it's also your tabs. So this makes a whole bunch of sense because, one, you don't have to teach people new mechanisms of thinking, right? Your grandmother can now use tabs because it's just implicit in this is one long page. And on top of that, we're using the vertical and horizontal space well, so you can actually print the entire name of the tab out to the left of the scroll bar because, you know, for at least Western languages, English goes, or text goes left to right. So I'd recommend going to play with this, and this is actually something right now we're working on bringing into and prototyping inside of Mozilla, are clever ways of playing with mechanisms that are already there. So that's cool. So there now you can't see that. That's a plug for him. Okay. So that was myth number 2. Yeah, sure. It does that. So when you click, oh, sure. So he says, how do you deal with the lost interaction of, the nice thing about tabs is that as you click between them, it remembers where you were, because your state is a very, very important thing to remember, right? It would be ideal that when I shut down my computer and turned it on again, it was in the exact place that it was before. Because you spend a lot of time getting your computer into a state. So he's saying, isn't that lost now? And the answer is not. When you actually click on the little buttons in the tab, it scrolls to where you were in that tab. So that's right. There's lots of little details that always make things work or not work. That scrolling that I have in the humanized reader, it turns out that Microsoft had come out with it in Windows Live Search, and it sucked. Like, nobody liked using it. They took it out. Why? Because it was a really bad implementation. They hadn't thought it through. They just sort of threw it in. So there's a lot there. So myth number 3, usability for noobs means no typing. This is something I see all the time, and I hate it. There's like this distinction, they say, between beginners and experts, and I'll come back to that in a second. And there isn't, right? So I have a claim, and that is that your mother probably uses a command line interface and doesn't even realize it. In fact, anybody that uses the web uses a command line interface and doesn't even realize it. Take a look at the URL bar, right? So this is in Firefox 3, the awesome bar, which I was pleased to find out humanized work was partially the inspiration for it. But before that, right, just the URL bar, you type in it, you go. So on the command line, you typed RC to go to news, and you type Pine to go to mail. Now you type nytimes.com to go to news, and gmail.com to go to mail. There's a direct analogy here, right? And millions and millions and millions of people are using a simplified command line. And as this command line actually does a lot more than that, right? You can type G space and then something to do a Google search from it. And sort of this linear learnability. Now, there's some problems with it, but it's still a command line. There's another command line that's starting to become in vogue. Have people used Google Calendars at all? So there's a quick add feature where you type Q, and it brings up a box, and you type 7 p.m. dinner with Asa Jasa, and it just goes into your calendar. And it's great. I know there's a lot of work done on this on the Chandler project. And that's cool, right? Because all of a sudden you don't have to think about it in the way the computer does, right? You're not getting that thin veneer over a database. You're typing in, you're interacting in the way that a human does. And in fact, although a lot of programming went into it, the user feels like there's no interface. And that's right, that's the win. So 30 boxes goes much further, right? You can actually, if you type a plus, I think, you can send your event to a friend, and it'll autocomplete to their to their email address. And there's a huge number of things you can do in this little box that you wouldn't realize as you first got into it, right? And it all scales really easily, so that the very beginner user will just come in and type what they want, and the little bit more advanced user will one by one learn the new features. So I'll come back to this idea, but it's, typing is not just for noobs, or typing is not just for expert users, it's for everyone. Everybody interacts well by text. So there's sort of this myth number 3.5 is that you have to design differently for beginners and experts, and that's not at all true. If you design well from the very beginning, you'll end up with designs that work just as well for beginners as for experts. And similarly, you'll end up with designs that work really well for blind users and sighted users. I guess I'll come back to that one in a minute, too. So linguistic command lines, and this is a thing that I was working on before getting sucked into Mozilla, which is called ENSO, which, by the way, as of like 3 weeks ago, is now a fully open source project, so I'm pretty proud of that. So let me just give you some simple examples. Let's see if you guys can see this at all. So this is just a standard text widget box, which you may or may not be able to see. And I want to do something in it. Say I want to type hello there. This is sort of cool. Now notice that there's absolutely no Chrome around this. There's not much I can do, but I can instead just call up an interface, which you can't really see, it's along the top, and just type what I want to do. So I want to count the number of words in there. So I can just type C-O-N-T. I see, aha, right below there, although you can't read it, there's something that says word count and character counts. So I'll mouse down, do a word count, and voila, 6 words. That's sort of cool. What other things can I do? Well, I could just say I want to do a calculation. So calculate. I just start typing C-A-L, figures out what I want. Calculate for functions, so I can type 3 times 5, or 6 over 5 over 2. And there we go, 7.5. It just worked, right? Now if I want to multiply that by 4, I can select it, calculate, and there we go, 30. It's really fast, right? And there's a lot of stuff I can do in here that wouldn't be possible with sort of the normal range. Using this system, like we were selling it, we'd have calls from 70-year-old men who thought this was awesome. They just wanted to tell us about it because they thought typing spell check, or the beginning of spell check, was so much easier than remembering what that little broken cupped coffee icon is in Word, right? That somehow means spelling. So, but there's a lot more that you can do here. There's a huge wealth of information that you can do here. So let's, to show off my math and physics group, we can type e to the pi I minus 1 equals 0. Select it, and now I wish that this were rendered beautifully. So I can just say render in tech. Oh, and I'm not connected to the internet. It would have just rendered it in tech, where I connected to the internet. Similarly, I could go Elite Cafe, San Francisco, which is a great cafe here, and I could say map it. And again, it won't work because I'm not connected to the internet. Yeah, indeed. But what would have happened is that the full map of where it was would just get inserted right there, right? So all of a sudden I pulled together a huge amount of information in ways that aren't possible with sort of the standard clicking mechanisms. And it's really easy to remember, and the same for beginners and experts, because it's just the same really simple text-based method. It's very similar to Quicksilver. They were conceived separately, although Quicksilver was definitely first. But I have this awesome email from Nicholas Jitkoff, who hates being singled out. Like we were giving a talk together, and he kept sort of like ducking. And then I was at Google the next day giving another talk, and I was like, and the Quicksilver guy is right here, and he literally crawled underneath his chair. He doesn't like to be pointed out, but he's done some awesome work. Yeah, absolutely. The difference is that Quicksilver, generally you find something first and then use it. Ours is very much more context-based, so you select something or use something and then you just go and do it. Ours is a little bit more geared towards everybody. He's, I think, a little bit more geared towards the sort of the nerdy or geeky user. But they're both awesome. They're both driving to the same thing, which is unifying information and unifying structures and functionality across your entire system, right? I think that Ubuntu would do really well to have something like this. And actually, it was really cool, right? After open sourcing, within 3 days, we had a version that was running on Windows, Mac, and Linux. It was like the community just was exceptional. So there's lots of neat things you can do in here, and a lot more as you sort of extend it, but this is the point. If you look at this sort of standard way of bridging the beginners to experts gap. How is it done? Menus, keyboard shortcuts. Keyboard shortcuts are hard to learn, fast to use, but aren't scalable, right? You only have so many keys on your keyboard. That, and they change every time you change application, except for a select few. Whereas menus, one, things are hard to find. You know what the most, like 90% of the requested features for Word are for features that are already in Word? Like, that shows you something's fundamentally wrong, but I'm sure it's even worse for OpenOffice. Like, menus aren't particularly scalable either. It's still hard to find things. They're really slow to use. So there's something better, right? And that's this, where you can type out the full name of what you're looking for. You can do the whole Google thing of saying, did you mean? In fact, we do. So it's really nice for beginner users. At the same time, it's really nice for expert users because we use autocomplete and learning. You get there immediately anyway. So that's what I mean when I say you can design well for beginners and for experts, and you don't have to run away from the command line when you want to bridge out to your average user. So myth number 4. Hiding complexity means simple and means easy. See this a lot, that people are like, okay, we'll just hide all the complexity that we want to keep away from the user in preferences. Or we'll give them one button, which will do everything. So you can't see this again. That's cool. It's a garage door opener. Beautifully illustrated, if I don't mind saying so myself. I actually went to a talk, and Frog Designs, the guy from Frog Designs was giving the talk, and he said that his favorite, like one of the best interfaces he'd seen, was the garage door opener. One button. How could it get any simpler than that? But how many of you have hit the garage door button? It started going down. You have to hit it. It starts going up. You hit it again. It stops. Now it's in an undetermined state. You hit it again. Who knows, right? You sit there and you'll hit it like 4 or 5 times before you get it in the right direction. This is not a simple interface. What I would show up in the next slide is Songza, which is another product of mine, which lets you do searching for music stuff online. It's pretty neat, and it uses pie menus and all sorts of other things. But one of the design decisions that we made was that there is no play-pause button. There's a play button and a pause button, because if you're on a slow internet connection or something hiccups, you don't know what state it's in. Does the pause symbol mean it is currently, or does the play symbol mean is it currently playing? Or if you hit this button, it will start playing. The pause button, does it mean that it's currently paused, or if you hit it, it will start pausing? Is that a thing you can do? So toggles are bad, right? That one button interface is hiding complexity behind a veil of simplicity, which isn't simple at all. It's hurting usability. So don't take, because it looks simple, that it is simple, right? So one of my favorite examples of this, besides the garage door opener, is oscilloscopes. Old-style oscilloscopes from the 1950s, 1960s had huge numbers of buttons, dials, and knobs on it. And there was a learning curve. You had to spend the time to know what each thing did. But after you learned it, or had somebody explain it to you, you could use it really easily, right? You knew, your hands knew where everything was. And even more than that, actually, they had a lot of text on there saying, this does that, this other button does this. You look at the new, I got sent a Fluke oscilloscope, digital, and it had 4 buttons on it, and a knob. And that knob did 25 different things, depending on the mode. I could no longer use it for doing actual electronics because it took far too long to use, right? It looked a lot simpler, it looked a lot less intimidating, but I couldn't actually use it, whereas that original oscilloscope with all the knobs and buttons, that was usable. So don't make the mistake of thinking that because it looks simple, it is. This is Songza. So here's an example of this in Windows. This is the taskbar and start menu properties. It looks not too bad, but try writing tech support for it, right? So what we did is we went through and we flattened the whole thing out. We took all of the options, all of the properties, all of the customized things, and we flattened it out. And this is actually how complex the preferences for taskbar and start menu properties are. Right? And there are still things in here which we didn't bother to expand out. It's huge, right? So because it looks simple doesn't make it simple. The right thing to have done in this case is to take as many of these things as possible and turn them into not preferences at all, right? Now, I may be getting into dangerous waters because I think GNOME does this very well in the sense that it chooses a couple things and says this is how we're going to do it, although oftentimes they're wrong. And KDE says, no, everything's going to be customizable. You have to start customizing before you can actually use it, right? And you should always prefer making things customizable in a default state. Every time you ask a question that the user doesn't care about, as a designer, you failed. So, because it looks simple doesn't make it simple. Myth number 5. Making it easier means copying Microsoft and Apple. Thank you. You really do get this one all the time. You'd think that people would be smarter than that, but they think making a program simple means copying. And it doesn't, right? So let's take, oh, darn, this is not on the internet. I was going to take calendaring. Oh, hey, it works somehow. So I showed you Google Calendar already. Everybody knows it. People have probably seen whatever Microsoft has for calendaring and iCal. Maybe there is a new way of thinking about it, which is much better than all of those. So this is a company called Social Helix that's taken a lot of the work in Zooming spaces that my father did a lot of work on people before that did a lot of working, so Zoomies, and applied it to calendaring, which is great. And here we go. So we're going to start here in February. And you can see everything for the 28th of, what is this? Of February, okay. So we just zoom in. They have this awesome idea of doing counterclockwise. Mouse circle means zoom out, and clockwise circle means zoom in. You might not think that's intuitive, but here's the cool thing. The Apple iPhone wasn't intuitive, isn't intuitive, right? The reason why everybody knows how to pick one up and do this or this is not because you naturally know how to do it. It's because they spent millions and millions of dollars showing advertisements with people doing this and this. So by the time you got it, you knew how to use it. There's a very famous case of somebody being showed how to use a mouse for the first time for user testing. It was a woman that had done system administration for a long time on computers. And they sat her down in front of I think it was the Mac, I can't remember what, and they gave her the mouse and said, go ahead, use it. What did she do? She picked up the mouse and tried moving it around in the air. Didn't work. Flipped it over. Aha, there's a little ball. I'll move that. Well, they've just disconnected the ball from the actual sensor, so that didn't work. She took it, she put it on the screen and tried to move it around. That didn't work very well. She couldn't see the cursor moving. She did the Scotty thing. You're like, hello, computer. That didn't work, right? She gave up. She put it down. Somebody showed her how to use it, and she could use it, right? So there's a difference between intuitiveness and ease of use, right? So this isn't particularly intuitive, but once you figure it out, it's very easy to use once you've been showed. So you just do a circle. You can zoom in. You can actually zoom in quite a bit. We don't need to do that. We'll zoom out. But this is cool, right? Because unlike the sort of traditional calendars, right, it's immediately obvious what I need to do to go to the next month. I just zoom out a little bit and then zoom in. If I wanted to go to a particular day, I just zoom in again, right? And it's immediately obvious if I want to go out of 2008 to 2009, what to do, right? I can get my full overview. It's immediately obvious that I can continue zooming out and get the entire 21st century, right? And I suppose I can continue zooming out from here. But it's really simple. It's using that one concept of zoom in, zoom out to represent time, and you're done. Right? It's actually fabulously wonderful how simple it is. So to come back in, I can just zoom in, zoom in, zoom in. And I'm back in. So it's very fast, too. So this is something which is fundamentally more usable than all those clicking on the little buttons of next, 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 show me next week, next month. And it's not copying anybody, right? So if you think outside the box or find a new box to think in, you can do a lot of good. So it's not always copying. And something really cool about this example is that I've just made it much smaller on the screen. And notice that it works just as well. So this metaphor actually scales perfectly from desktop to the mobile. That's sort of like the holy grail of the next 5 to 10 years, is be able to cross that chasm, having a continuity of experience across mobile and desktop. Well, this does it effortlessly, right? This is better than the iPhone in lots of ways. So I think this is a chance where we can say, okay, open source world, this has a number of engineering problems to defeat, but that's what they're really good at. So, I think there's a lot to be done where we say, don't copy, do something else, do something new. That's not what we mean when we say make it useful. So what have you learned today? Or what should you have learned? One, that interface design is about how software is used, how your software is used, which which means that if you've ever made any application whatsoever, if you've ever made any command line application whatsoever, you have made an interface, a website. You've made an interface. And the currency, as I said before, of how well your program is doing is how many people use it and how useful it is for them. So that's number one. Number two is that usability is architectural. It's not about choosing a nice color blue, although that's actually part of it. If you read Don Norman stuff, you find out that pretty things, for whatever reason, people will use better. Now, they won't just think it's easier to use, but they'll actually work faster in that system. It's odd. But usability is architectural. You need to think about it in the upstream so that it doesn't cost you a lot to change downstream, right? That whole zooming thing I just showed you, if you designed your calendar and got to the end of like, okay, let's make it usable, you'd never arrive there. So usability is architectural and should be thought about at the same level as architecting your sort of software world. I'll come back to, before we do number 3, which is well-designed command lines are good for usability. Do people know who Malcolm Gladwell is? He wrote Blink, and he wrote, what is that, his other book? The Tipping Point, thank you. So he did an awesome talk, which is about happiness and tomato sauce, which is cool because tomato sauce is pretty happy-making, especially when it's good. But his point was this. In 30 years of doing focus group research and asking the community in a very real way what kind of tomato sauce they liked, they said they liked spicy and they liked original. And so that's what they did. So Prego went and contacted a consultant who is very unusual in saying, he first did this for Pepsi, when Pepsi asked him to make the very best Diet Pepsi. And they gave him a certain range in which he should make it sweet. And he came back, he got his data, and you're expecting it to look like a bell curve, and you say, okay, that's the best sweetness. And it came off looking like this. And they said, well, what do you do? And he said, you're making a mistake. You're not looking for the perfect Pepsi. That's the wrong question. You should be looking for the perfect Pepsis. So he did the same thing. They didn't believe him. They booed him off stage. He did the same thing for tomato sauce. And he varied tomato sauce in every conceivable spectrum, right? Everything from zestiness to visible solids, which is a great term. And they came back and he graphed, and this time he was looking for little groups where people clustered. And he found out that people, in fact, were desiring, deep in their hearts, chunky tomato sauce. And nobody in the 30 years of focus groups had ever thought to say that deep down in their heart's deepest and most distant recesses were they desiring tomato sauce. And it turns out a third of the U.S. population was desiring chunky tomato sauce. Your users don't know what they want, is the thing. I mean, he put it in the phrase, the mind knows not what the tongue wants. In this case, users don't know what features they want. This is something that has to be architected, thought about from the very beginning. Otherwise, people will end up saying, make this look like a feature I've seen in Microsoft Word. That's where that myth comes from, right? So we need to do a lot of thinking and architecting first. So number 3, well-designed command lines are good for usability. There's another example that I didn't talk about. In Microsoft Word, you'd be surprised to find there's actually a command line in there. In the print dialog box, you get to choose what pages you're going to print. And there are a whole bunch of methods in other places where you can sort of use a GUI to click, like print the first page, the second page, the fifth page. And they gave it up, and they have a little box that you just type the numbers. So you can type page 1, 2, 5 to 10, 7 through 25, odd. It's a command line. That's awesome, right? So we can learn a lot. We can take a lot of advice and saying, well, let's not run away from the command line. It was done by overly parsimonious engineers in the 60s. Like for me, trying to remember the command line options for tar is sort of like trying to bob for apples in a cement mixer. It's not very pleasant. But you can do a lot better, right? So you can use autocomplete and a whole bunch of the sort of the newer features in thinking and full names to be able to get information theoretic efficient interfaces that are good for beginners and experts, right? Imagine, for instance, that we just placed all menus with sort of a nice big list of them, like not linear, but sort of a nice sort of stocked in the Wall Street Journal style, and just a little box you type in to select the menu you wanted, and that was it. We get a huge usability increase just for that. That's true. I would say that's... What? Oh, he said, is there a way to do that without the keyboard? And that's a great question. I could give you the false answer, sort of, or duck the question and say, voice input. But, things like that zooming interface I just showed actually scale very well to when you don't have an interface like that. And clearly menus don't scale very well either. But there are lots of ways of sort of starting to attack that problem. So well-designed command lines are good for usability. Beginners and experts don't require separate interfaces. So again, what I was just saying, one of my favorite examples of this is that my father, who's the guy that did the Apple Macintosh project, the Macintosh project at Apple, it's a little bit unfortunate. Like most kids are carried around in a stroller. I was carried around in the original Macintosh carry case, which was later used for our laundry. I don't know what that means. But so one of the things he came up with was this great way of moving around text. And it's very much like Emacs in the sense that you hold down a key, you type where you want to go, and it moves the cursor there. Really simple. There's one key for forward, one key for back. That's it. You hit both and it'll select. So just from a time-wise, if you use the mouse to select anywhere on screen, in your text it takes 3.5 seconds. With the sort of incremental search, it takes 1.5 seconds. The funny thing here is that if you multiply the number of times you move your cursor per day, tie the number of days in a year by the number of hours that people work, by the number of people in the U.S., by their average wage, that number that we're wasting on a bad interface for moving your cursor around costs us more money than combating spam. Like, quite literally. So there's a lot to be said there. But anyway, so I was using this interface. There's an open source project called Archie that is helping to run. And I was giving a talk for the Danish National Library for the Blind. And they were working on audiobooks. And the way they do it is if you want to listen to an audiobook, there's a page for skipping between chapters, or a button for skipping between chapters, for skipping between pages, paragraphs, sentences. So if you wanted to navigate, you literally have to sit there hitting it, listen, being like, oh, that's not where I want, next page, next page, next page. It's really hard to navigate. They actually have in this format called DAISY. It's an XML format. It has the position of where in the tape you are to what is being said down, roughly to the second, even better. So what I did was really simple. I just hooked up this sort of thing where I could leap around, just holding down a key, typing where I want to go, closed the sort of the top of my laptop, projected behind me the actual book, and asked them to tell me where to go in Alice in Wonderland. And I was able to do it with no training and get to anywhere in that book instantaneously, and their mouths dropped. They're like, you're just a brand new user and you're able to do this. Why is that? And it's like, well, because if you're designing for yourself and you're designing for the sighted person, that interface should work not only for the beginner and for the expert, but also for disabled users in many ways. Designing for human beings is universal. So beginners and experts don't require separate interfaces. And the last thing is don't blindly copy, find another box to think in. Oh, not lastly. And number 6 is, of course, my hat is, in fact, awesome. So there we go. That's sort of my brief talk of the 5, 6 myths in interface design that I see sort of plaguing the open source world. And that if we can just sort of get a little bit beyond and sort of indoctrinate our developers just slightly differently, we'll be able to sort of pull in a much wider range of people and do a lot more. And actually, I think, cross that chasm and make it into the world where, Linux could be run by everyone. So there we go. If you want to contact me, there's Humanized. I'm now at Mozilla, so I'm just asa@mozilla.com. And we're doing a lot of fun stuff. So thanks. If you guys have any questions, feel free. I think we have 6 minutes. I can't have explained so well that you have no questions. Who's doing? Well, so I'm really excited about the move to redesign GIMP. I think that's awesome. That whole blog thing there, that's cool. Emacs is really hard to learn, but it's very, very consistent. So one of my favorite questions is to say, if I hold out this phone and let go, what will happen? It's going to fall, right? And if it didn't fall, 1, I could probably get a new line of work, but 2, you guys would be very, very surprised, right? What on the computer is that consistent? There's pretty much nothing except for crashing. But at least that doesn't happen consistently. One of the things Emacs does very well is that it's very, very consistent. So once you've learned it, it's simple. Of course, there are lots of other little issues, but that's sort of cool and unusual. Most people won't say it's actually a good interface design. Firefox, I think, is pretty good. Python. So this is following in one of my coworkers, Jono, wrote an article about 10 ways of designing great open source projects. Python is very, very usable. And I will align myself right up here and say that I think it's much more usable than Perl. And that's because of a fundamental change in architecture. And that is, in Perl, there's always more than one way to do things. In Python, there's exactly one way to do things. You always want to be designing for exactly one way to do things, because that way should be the best. You should put in the forethought in the beginning to figure out what the best thing is to do, and then enable that. Does that answer your question? Individual people? Probably be bad of me to say Guido and Stallman, wouldn't it? I'd have to go find some more. Actually, that would be a great thing to blog about, to highlight some really stunning work done by individuals. Any other questions?
Yeah, I was just wondering if this is going to be online anywhere to we could actually see what you were pointing at, or.
If you do a search for "Don't Make Me Click,"
okay.
It's not exactly this talk, but it has a lot of overlap at Google, so they put it all up online. You can see a lot of the same demos.
And then I was curious. You mentioned something about Archie. You implemented something for blind users to be able to navigate.
Right.
Did you implement a new interface that was different from what they had? I didn't understand.
Oh, sorry. So Archie, ARCHY, is now sort of the defunct program, but it still runs, based on Jeff Raskin's, my dad's, book, The Human Interface. It's taking a lot of those ideas and bringing them to light. And so it was using a technology called what was called Leap, which is just an incremental search, quasi-modal, i.e. you hold down a key while you do it, to go forward and backward. And I just was demonstrating that. I implemented a very simple command called talk, in the same way that I was just showing with ENSO that I could just do commands. Well, it was really simple, right? In Python, it was like 3 lines of code to take the selection and speak it. And that's all. So it was using that very same text editor to just use it for an audio output device for audiobooks. And so there's almost no work in design change. It's something that I had been using for a year, but now it's just a one little tweak, and it worked great as an audiobook reader for the blind.
Hi. Could you maybe recommend some resources on interface design that you've learned from or have liked in the past?
Sure. So in terms of books, there's the Humane Interface. There is the Don Norman series. Those are sort of normal. I would highly recommend getting Understanding Comics by Scott McCloud. Those are awesome. And if you think about them in terms of interface design, they'll teach you quite a bit. There's also all of the Tufte books, Edward Tufte, and his quantitative design of information. One of my sort of mantras is that when you design, you should be designing as if it was for a printed page. That's a great place to start, because that's going to maximize the amount of information that you're putting up to the user in a nice way. And we've been investigating how to do that and working on that for hundreds of years, right? Thousands of years. We should take advantage of that. So those are some resources that I'd start with.
Sorry, it's 4 o'clock, so unfortunately we have another talk.
I don't get a naked guy on the gong?
You don't, sadly.
Oh,
no.
right.
Well, unless you really, really want one. I'm sure Ack will volunteer.
This is San Francisco, after all. I feel so much gypped.
So, I assume you'll be around later on if people have other questions that come up
sure.
to you. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you.